Hi, this is the final part of our three-part series looking at Indigenous education in Canada. As we start, I want to ask ourselves again, what treaty am I under? What land am I on? And I want you to think about who is affected by this treaty. What does it mean to be under a treaty? So look at this map, find where you live, and see what treaty you're under. The treaty that I live under is the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. A treaty is an agreement to share the land. It's always accompanied by wampum belts. You'll remember in the video that we watched by Wab Kinew, he talked about the Two River wampum, where the Crown promised to come alongside Indigenous peoples in Canada and not to molest them. Here's a different wampum. This is the wampum presented at the end of the War of 1812 and is a pledge by the Crown of Canada not to interfere with our culture or governance. So treaties are made between sovereign nations. They're always accompanied by wampum belts. It's not just the words on the page, but the wampum carries meaning as well, and often the two are separated. So when you think about it, what land are you on, and what treaty are you under? And remember that you are bound by that treaty. Treaties are about sharing the land. This week, I asked you to read the first part of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Policy Framework. This was first published in 2007 and still governs how we approach Indigenous issues in schools today. And so if we look at it, it has three main goals. One is to have a high level of student achievement, to reduce the gap in student achievement, and to have high levels of public confidence. Now, the other article I asked you to read looks at this document and points out some of its failings. Megan does a great job at showing us how this policy is written from a deficit lens and is paternalistic in its approach. It is the government's belief about what they can do best to help Indigenous people. And that's a good thing, but it's much better if we consult with Indigenous peoples. The other problem with the policy is that it doesn't stand alone. In Ontario, we have an extensive curriculum that we use to teach children. And this curriculum is written from a white middle-class perspective, which puts Indigenous children at a disadvantage. The Auditor General's report in 2004 stated that we need 28 years to close the gap. But the problem is that in 2020, we're no closer to closing the gap than we were in 2004. In the summer of 2018, the Ministry of Education had planned to update the curriculum and infuse it with Indigenous content. And a team was put together, but at the last minute, the current government that we have canceled the meeting and chose instead to continue to use the policies that we have. And this just goes to show and to compound the systemic racism towards Indigenous people that we can see in the news today, and why the federal government has called an emergency meeting this weekend. And you would have seen issues being raised throughout the country. There was the poor woman who died in hospital in Quebec and recorded the taunts from her caregivers. The unrest out east over the fisheries. The fights over land and pipelines out west. The continuing tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the legacy of residential schools are all things that are still current and challenging in today's environment. But it's important for you to realize that even though the provincial government here in Ontario canceled the rewrite of the curriculum itself is open enough so that you can include Indigenous content and Indigenous perspectives in your teaching. It is possible to address and redress these wrongs and the challenges in our society. We need to infuse our curriculum and our pedagogy and our teaching with Indigenous culture and language. There's a few things that we need to remember from the last video, right? Indigenous culture and language are always local. It's not hard. We just need to find inroads to celebrate Indigenous culture in our classrooms. We can include legends and stories, and we can include Indigenous language education. If your school board doesn't offer it, there are several YouTube channels, podcasts, websites where language speakers are sharing their love and passion for their language so that you can learn it. It doesn't require you to become fluent in Anishinaabe. You can learn a few words, count to 10. Simple things like saying Ani when you see your students in the morning, and Miigwech, thank you. You need to take your students out on the land and to support Indigenous approaches to education. When we think about Indigenous education, we need to remember that the language comes from the land, and that culture comes from language, and that identity comes from culture. And it is these four things working in harmony that will lead to improvements in your Indigenous students, will lead to you closing that gap identified by the Auditor General, and will lead to the success of your Indigenous students. It's not difficult. Talk to your school board's Indigenous lead. They will have a plethora of resources and people for you to talk to and ideas for you. They are typically people that are passionate about the culture and language and want to help you. Reach out and contact them. Form partnerships in the community. Meet with elders and knowledge keepers. And welcome community members into your class. And finally, go out into the community and participate in cultural events. Let your students see you celebrating their culture. Let the community members see you being serious about learning more about their culture. It's not about being able to speak the language fluently. It's not about knowing all of the stories and the legends and the proper times to tell them. It's about trying. It's about being conscious about including Indigenous identity, language, culture as a part of your classroom. That small difference in your teaching practice makes a huge difference in the lives of your students. It's not hard. And I believe in each of you that you can do this for your students. The main thing is that you try. Every small step will lead to another. And as you learn more, you will grow as a teacher, and your students will benefit, and they will appreciate the effort. And that will make all the difference. Miigwech, and thank you for listening. I look forward to the discussion we're going to have in class. Thank you.